Hello, and welcome to our new series about notorious murderers, criminals, and legends. My name is Corey, and I'm here with my partner, Jennifer.
Hello, crew, and thanks again for joining us. Today, we're diving deep into the mystery of one of America's most notorious conmen and murderers, H. Holmes. Now let's begin.
Chicago, 1886. It was a city vividly alive and violently expanding. A sprawling grid of soot, steel and slaughter. The stockyards to the south reeked of iron and offal, a smell that the wind carried into the parlours of the wealthy and the tenements of the poor alike. It was a place where a man could reinvent himself, where a name could be shed like a snake sheds its skin. Into this chaotic, soot-stained metropolis stepped a man of unremarkable height, but remarkable presence. He had eyes of a piercing, watery blue, and a moustache waxed to sharp points. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a physician, though his medical degree was as slippery as his morals. He called himself Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. To the census takers, he was a statistic. To the women who caught his eye, he was a dashing, tragic romantic. But to history, he would become the first distinctively American monster. A predator who didn't hunt in dark alleyways, but built a factory designed to process human life. This is not just a story of murder, it is a story of architecture. Holmes did not begin with blood, he began with charm. He arrived in the suburb of Englewood, a developing district on the precipice of a boom. At the corner of 63rd and Wallace stood a drugstore owned by an ailing woman named Mrs. Holton. Her husband was dying of cancer, and the burden of the business was crushing her. Holmes was the solution. He was deferential, knowledgeable, and radiated a competence that put the weary Mrs. Holton at ease. He offered to buy the store, allowing her to retire. The deal was struck. A promissory note, a handshake, and a smile that didn't quite reach those cold blue eyes. Within months, Mrs. Holton vanished. When neighbours asked, Holmes looked sombre. California, he told them. Relatives. A tragic rush. They believed him because he was Dr. Holmes, the man who gave candy to children and listened intently to the complaints of old widows. He was the most charming man in Englewood. With the pharmacy secured, Holmes looked across the street. There was an empty lot there, a scar of dirt waiting for a structure. Holmes didn't just see land, he saw a kingdom. He envisioned a building that would serve two purposes, a commercial fortress to fund his lifestyle and a private sanctuary where his darker impulses could be indulged without interruption. He began to sketch. The construction of the building at 63rd and Wallace became a local legend, a spectacle of confusion and grandeur. It was 1887, and the structure rising from the earth was unlike anything the Midwest had seen. It was a monstrosity of red brick, turreted and imposing, 3 stories of looming Gothic eccentricity. But it was the way it was built that whispered of madness. Holmes acted as his own architect. He hired a crew of bricklayers, worked them for 3 weeks until their wages came due, and then fired them, claiming their work was shoddy. He would hire a new crew the next morning. He repeated this cycle with carpenters, plumbers, and gas fitters. The brilliance of this scheme was twofold. First, he rarely paid a dime for labour. Second, and far more crucial, no single workman ever understood the layout of the house. One crew built a hallway that ended in a solid wall. Another installed doors that opened into brickwork. A third team installed a gas line that fed into rooms with no lighting fixtures, controlled by valves hidden in a master closet in Holmes's bedroom. The ground floor was respectable, retail shops, a new pharmacy, a jewellery counter. But the second and third floors, they were a labyrinth. There were stairways that led nowhere. There were rooms with 5 doors and rooms with none. There were asphyxiation chambers, soundproof vaults lined with asbestos and steel plate. There were chutes, greased and wide enough for a human body, that dropped directly from the upper residential suites down to the basement. And the basement was the heart of the machine. It contained a dissecting table, a stretching rack, and a kiln large enough to incinerate a human being, disguised as a glass-bending furnace. By 1891, the castle, as the locals called it, was complete. It stood like a dark sentinel over Englewood, and just in time, for Chicago had won the bid to host the world's Columbian Exposition. The World's Fair was coming. Millions of tourists, flush with cash and naivety, were about to descend on the city. Holmes placed an ad in the papers. World's Fair Hotel. Luxury accommodations for visitors, close to the rail line. The spider had finished his web. Now he needed flies. Her name was Julia Connor. She was tall, with a striking figure and a vivacious energy that her dull, plodding husband, Ned, could not contain. Ned Connor worked at the jewellery counter in Holmes's pharmacy. They moved into the castle with their young daughter, Pearl. It didn't take long. Holmes had a scent for dissatisfaction. He saw Julia's boredom, her hunger for a life that was more vibrant than the one Ned could provide. Holmes began the grooming process. It was subtle at first. Lingering glances, compliments on her dress, accidental brushes of the hand. Julia fell hard. She was flattered by the attention of the wealthy doctor. They began an affair right under Ned's nose. When Ned eventually found out, he didn't fight for her. He quit his job and left, leaving Julia and little Pearl behind in the castle. This was exactly what Holmes wanted. Isolation. For a time, Julia was the lady of the manor. She strutted through the twisting corridors, believing she was the mistress of the castle. She managed the books. She helped Holmes dodge the endless stream of creditors who came banging on the door. She thought they were partners, but then the inevitable happened. Julia became pregnant. In Holmes's calculus, people were assets until they became liabilities. A mistress was an asset. A pregnant mistress demanding marriage was a liability. It was Christmas Eve, 1891. The castle was cold, the wind howling off Lake Michigan, rattling the window panes. Julia was frantic. She told Holmes she would leave him if he didn't marry her. She threatened to expose his insurance scams. Holmes, ever the soothing physician, calmed her down. He had a solution, he said. He couldn't marry a pregnant woman. The scandal would be too great. But, he explained, he had a medical background. He could perform a procedure, an abortion. It would be safe, quick, and then they could be married properly. He led her to the operating room on the second floor. "Trust me, Julia," he whispered, his voice like velvet. "Breathing this will make you sleep. When you wake up, all our problems will be gone." He placed the chloroform rag over her face. Julia Connor breathed in deeply, looking into the eyes of the man she loved, trusting him implicitly. Her eyes fluttered shut. Holmes waited until her breathing stopped. He didn't perform an abortion. He simply held the rag. When she was gone, he went to the next room where little Pearl was playing with her Christmas toys. He picked the child up. "Mama is sleeping," he said. "Let's go downstairs." Later that night, the neighbours reported seeing smoke billowing from the castle's chimney. It smelled strange, thick, greasy, and sweet. With Julia gone, the castle needed new blood. But Holmes was also building a different kind of army, an army of skeletons. He had a connection at a nearby medical school. He knew that bodies were in high demand for anatomy classes. In the basement of the castle, Holmes became an artisan. He would strip the flesh from his victims using quicklime and corrosive acids in the vats he had installed. He would then meticulously rearticulate the bones, wiring them together into perfect medical skeletons. He sold the skeletons to universities for $200 apiece. He was selling his victims back to the very society that failed to protect them. But he needed help. The volume of business was increasing. He recruited a man named Benjamin Pitezel. Pitezel was a carpenter with a criminal record and a drinking problem. He was a rough, simple man, the antithesis of the polished Holmes, but he was loyal. Pitezel became Holmes's right hand, his fixer, and eventually his proxy. "Ben," Holmes would say, leaning over the blueprint of a new insurance scam. "The world is full of fools, holding on to money that belongs to men of vision." Pitezel didn't know the full extent of the horrors in the basement. Or, if he did, he drank enough whiskey to forget them. He helped Holmes install the gas jets in the guest rooms. These were the pièce de résistance of the castle. In the guest rooms, intended for the World's Fair tourists, there were gas fixtures on the walls, but they didn't work. The guests would try to light them, fail, and go to sleep in the dark. But the real nozzle was inside the wall, invisible. Holmes could sit in his bedroom, turn a valve, and flood a specific guest room with lethal gas. He could kill without ever entering the room. He could listen at the door as the coughing stopped and the silence took over. May 1st, 1893. The World's Columbian Exposition opened. It was a miracle of plaster and electricity. The White City rose in Jackson Park, a neoclassical dreamland that promised the dawn of a new century. Millions flocked to Chicago. The trains were overflowing, hotels were booked solid, and there, just a short tram ride away, stood the castle. Holmes's World's Fair Hotel was open for business. The lobby was warm and inviting. The rates were reasonable. The host was charming. Young women travelling alone for the first time in history to see the wonders of the fair were his preferred clientele. They arrived with trunks full of clothes and savings pinned inside their corsets. They were teachers, stenographers, heiresses looking for adventure. They checked in. They rarely checked out. One such guest was Emmeline Chigrand. She was a beautiful blonde stenographer who Holmes had hired as his personal secretary. Like Julia before her, she was seduced by his intellect and his wealth. She wrote home to her family in Indiana, gushing about the wonderful Dr. Holmes and the magical life she was leading in Chicago. She told them she was going to be married. On the day she was meant to leave to visit her family, Holmes asked her to step into the walk-in vault in his office to retrieve some papers. The vault was airtight. It was lined with steel. Emmeline stepped inside. Holmes, standing at the door, smiled a terrifying, empty expression, devoid of malice, devoid of anything human. "Goodbye, Emmeline," he said softly. He swung the heavy steel door shut. He spun the tumbler. Inside, the panic set in immediately. Emmeline pounded on the metal. She screamed until her throat tore. Outside, Holmes sat at his desk, lit a cigar, and began to read the morning paper. He enjoyed the muffled thumping. It was the sound of success. It took hours for the oxygen to run out. By the summer of 1893, the fair was in full swing, but a dark undercurrent was swirling around Englewood. Too many people were looking for lost daughters. Too many letters went unanswered. The castle was humming with activity. The kiln in the basement was running hot, but Holmes was getting greedy. His insurance scams were becoming more reckless. He had set fire to the third floor of the castle to claim a policy, but the investigator, a sharp man named F.G. Cow, was suspicious. The fire had started in 4 different places. The valuable furniture Holmes claimed was destroyed turned out to be cheap junk. Cow refused to pay. He began to dig into Holmes's past. He found the trail of aliases. He found the unpaid debts. And then there was Minnie Williams. Minnie was an heiress from Texas, plain-looking but wealthy, possessing a deed to property in Fort Worth worth a fortune. Holmes courted her with an intensity that bordered on desperation. He needed her money to keep the castle running, to pay off the mounting debts, to keep the creditors at bay. He moved her into the castle. He invited her sister, Nanny, to visit.
"Come to Chicago," Minnie wrote to Nanny. Brother Harry is a genius. We are going to travel the world.
Nanny arrived in July. The sisters attended the fair, dazzled by the Ferris wheel and the electric lights. They returned to the castle, exhausted and happy. That night, Holmes suggested a tour of the building. "I have made some renovations," he said, guiding them toward the stairwell that led down past the first floor into the damp, chemical-smelling darkness of the basement.
It's a bit dark, Nanny said, hesitating on the stairs.
"Don't worry," Holmes said, his hand resting gently, firmly on the small of her back. "I know the way perfectly." The summer heat in Chicago was oppressive. The stench of the stockyards was overwhelming. Holmes emerged from the basement 3 hours later. He was sweating, his shirt sleeves rolled up. He went to the pharmacy counter and poured himself a glass of water. A man was waiting for him, a man in a bowler hat, leaning against the counter with a grim expression. He wasn't a creditor. He wasn't a tenant. "Dr. Holmes?" the man asked. "I am," Holmes replied, his pulse not raising a single beat. "My name is Geyer," the man said, "Detective Frank Geyer. I'm with the Philadelphia police, but I'm working with the Pinkerton Agency." Holmes smiled, the same charming smile he had given Mrs. Holton, Julia Connor, Emmeline Sigrand, and the Williams sisters. "How can I help you, Detective?" "We're looking into a matter regarding a life insurance policy," Geyer said, his eyes scanning the shop, lingering on the heavy iron door that led to the upper floors. "And we have some questions about a missing person." Holmes took a sip of water. The kiln in the basement was just reaching its peak temperature. He could feel the heat radiating through the floorboards beneath his feet. "I have nothing to hide, Detective," Holmes lied. "Please, come in." As Geyer stepped forward, the bell above the door chimed, a cheerful sound that masked the roar of the furnace below. The game was no longer predator and prey. Now it was hunter and hunted. This concluded part 1 of our story regarding H. Holmes, Im Corey.
And Im Jennifer.
And we thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe to our channel, Frightening True Crimes. It helps us grow and bring you more tantalizing stories. Till next time, stay spooky.